Good evening and welcome to the International Literacy Association's webinar, Disrupting Instructional Paradigms by Embracing Culturally Responsive Pedagogies. My name is Julius B. and I'm your host for the evening. I'm the president of the St. Louis Black Authors of Children's Literature and the Believe Project. I am also president of the St. Louis Regional Literacy Association, a chapter of the Missouri Literacy Association. Through my work with St. Louis Black Authors and the Believe Project, we work to essentially ensure that all children become confident and competent readers by the end of third grade. But we have a particular interest in Black children's third grade reading success. And so our work is designed to create lots of innovative opportunities for children to have consistent access to relevant and responsive literature, as well as literacy experiences. And that's what tonight's conversation really is all about. It's about giving kids opportunities to hear authentic voice and to see themselves in the learning process. We have the perfect speaker and the perfect presenter to lead us in this conversation tonight. Her name is Glendaliz Martinez Almonte. Let me share a little bit about her background with you. Glendaliz works nationally for Curriculum Associates, advising districts in their implementation of high standards, culturally responsive teaching supports, English learner resources as well. This year, Glendaliz celebrates her 20th year in education. Glendaliz has taught at every grade level, including English language arts at the college level and English for speakers of other languages to adults throughout her community. During her educational career, she has supported school districts in their planning, writing, and implementation of curriculum to ensure equity and access for marginalized students. Before Glendaliz speaks, I want to just share just a couple of things with you. One, we will have questions or take questions at the end of her presentation. If you like to submit questions, please do that via the Zoom Q&A box or the Zoom chat box. You can also put comments or questions in the comment section on Facebook Live as well. Also, if you're following us on Twitter, please remember to tag us, and you can do that by using the ampersand and then typing ILA today, or you can use the hashtag symbol and then type ILA Webinar. If you like to watch or share this event with a colleague, you may do so directly following this event on ILA's Facebook page. A closed caption recording will be available within 10 days on ILA's YouTube channel as well. All right, now without any other hesitation, I am excited and thrilled to introduce to you the incredible Glendaliz Martinez Almonte.
Good evening, everyone. Well, hello, everyone, because I know that there are folks here from all over the world. So I thank you for being here and for joining us and for listening. Now, if you would just have a little patience with me here, I'll get this presentation up. And here we are. So thank you again for being here. Thank you, Julius, for the introduction. I really appreciate it. And of course, today we are here to talk about culturally responsive pedagogy, right? But before I get into the cultural aspects of how we teach our students, I always start by telling a story. And I love telling Arturo Schomburg's story. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Arturo Schomburg, I feel like this is gonna be a quick lesson on who he was. And for those of you who are familiar with Arturo Schomburg, I'm pleased to know that you are. So let me just share a little bit about Arturo Alfonso Schomburg. He was an Afro-Puerto Rican man who was born in Puerto Rico, went to school in Puerto Rico up until he was 17 years old and moved to New York. So the story goes that one of his grade school teachers, he had asked for history of his people, and by his people he meant Black people. And allegedly his teacher says to him, your people don't have any history, or we don't study your people's history, one or the other, right? And from that point on, as he lived his life, it was almost like he was having a conversation with this teacher by collecting artifacts about Black folks across the diaspora. So it wasn't just about Black people in America and Puerto Rico, it was across the board. He spent his life gathering what he called vindicating evidences, and essentially had about 10,000 artifacts in his house. Can you imagine in New York City, in your house, the way his wife described it? So he had documents from the floor to the ceiling stacked up. But his collection of these 10,000 vindicated evidences eventually became what we now know as the Schomburg Center, that is part of the New York City Public Library and can be found on 125th Street, right? I like to talk about Arturo Schomburg, because he's relatively unknown outside of where I'm from in New York City. But the other reason why I like to talk about Arturo Schomburg is because there's a center named after him. He's an Afro-Latino that a lot of people don't know about. He was such a great contributor to the Harlem Renaissance and to that social scene. He wasn't a college educated man, but he wanted children like him to be able to see themselves in the content that they were engaging with. And so I think that Arturo Schomburg's legacy is something that everyone should know about. His legacy is so important because it gives children someone to look to who looks like them. And there are so many other people like Arturo Schomburg out there for our kids to learn about. But today I'm just focusing on Arturo so that we all have something to walk away with, a little nugget of information. And if you are ever in New York City, please go up to the Schomburg Center. It's pictured here. It's an amazing place. There's so much in there. There's so much history in there. And I just think that for everyone in this world, they should be able to see that library. So Goldie Muhammad tells us that we know that books matter. So too do the representation and diversity of thought reflected in the content of those books, right? That is what we are here to talk about today. What is it that we are providing our children? How are we instructing our children to learn reading? How can we change the narrative around our children, around marginalized children? And what can we do to make that better, right? So I want all of you, or some of you, you don't all have to respond, but I would love to hear from you in the chat. If you could just answer for me, when did you first deeply connect with a written story? If you could just stop and think about the first time you engaged with some written text and you connected with that story. How old were you? Where were you? What were you reading? I would love to hear from you in the chat. Lunch notes from my mother. Okay. Oh, that's so cute. The Snowy Day. That's my friend's son's favorite story. Silver Sword, At Home at 3 years old, at 5, Where the Wild Things Are. 8th grade, Fly Girl. Okay. I'm trying to keep up. I'm Not Your Perfect Mexican Daughter. Fabulous. 1st grade, June B. Jones. Mildred Taylor, 5th grade. Where the Wild Things Are. I remember a story about a woman who survived the plane crash. I was about 10, reading a children's biography about Ben Franklin with my dad. Before I could read by myself. In my 20s, reading a book called I Like Me to Daycare Kids. I was 15, Jupiter Plague. I'm just reading what's in the chat, folks. A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. I remember that book. Charlotte's Web, yes. Tea with Milk. Mouse and Motorcycle. Raymond Ditmar, Snake Hunter, Collector. Green Eggs and Ham by Dr. Seuss. Whistle for Willie. Okay, The Pearl. All right, I'm gonna have to stop at some point, but these are awesome. Thank you all for The Owl and the Pussycat. As a child, my mom really read it to me. The Count of Monte Cristo, great book. Loved I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. Yes, all right. So thank you all for sharing. I love asking people when they first deeply connected with text, with a written story. I don't always say book because I think it's really important for us to just allow for people to tell us what that written text was. It could have been a note. And I love the lunch notes from my mom, right? For me, the first time that I ever deeply connected with a written story, now I read Curious George Goes to the Zoo. That was my first book that I ever owned, but I didn't deeply connect with Curious George Goes to the Zoo. The first book I ever deeply connected with was Song of Solomon by Toni Morrison. And I read that book when I was in 12th grade in my English seminar class. And I think about why I connected so much to this book. Toni Morrison's writing changed my life. It gave me a completely different perspective. And I think that the reason why was because until that point, I hadn't really read a lot of Black literature that provided different perspectives on the Black experience in the United States, right? So for me, there was so much in the book to look up. Pilate's name, taking the piece of paper from the Bible and putting it in her brass box and hanging it from her ear, even though she couldn't write. Milkman's story, Guitar Story, the 7 Days organization, all of these things that Toni Morrison was able to put in there. And it just changed me because it was something that I hadn't seen at all up until I was in 12th grade. And I said to myself, man, how is it possible that I've gotten to the point, yes, Nicole, that I've gotten to the point where I'm in 12th grade, I'm 16 years old. And this is the first time I'm really feeling like a book changed me, right? And I think about that moment a lot because I say to myself, when do marginalized children, when do children from different cultures, when do they start to engage with content that isn't part of the mainstream narrative, right? We know that right now in the United States, everyone's talking about the science of reading as a defining moment. And it is really because the narrative that is coming out of it is that reading is a fundamental human right. This is from their preamble. Reading is a fundamental human right that empowers individuals in a society. Literacy is a civil right, right? We want to ensure that children can engage, that children are learning, that children want to read. And for me personally, as a former English teacher, I want children to have a joy of reading. I want children to love reading, right? And I think that there are times where I can look back on my educational career and go, there were some real books there that I didn't really enjoy that I had to read. And even when I was teaching, there were books that I couldn't stand teaching just because I didn't like the book, right? Like The Scarlet Letter, I hated teaching that book. And I think I could read it now and enjoy it as an adult, but teaching it was very difficult for me. It wasn't something that I enjoyed. It wasn't something that my students enjoyed, right? So we have to think about this notion of the civil right of reading, of literacy, and how that's fundamental to our children's ability to engage, not just in school, but in the world, right? So when we start to think about what the challenges of reading instruction have been over, I would say at least the last 30 years, first, there was this high emphasis on skills, right? We've been drilling and skilling is what I like to call it, drilling and skilling our kids to death, right? Almost to the point where we took the joy out of learning. We've taken the joy out of teaching, where we've said to ourselves, oh, you have to know these skills, you have to know these standards, and really important, right? So we're not saying remove the skills by any means. So today, you'll as I go along in this presentation today, at no point will I say we should not be teaching skills, because we need to teach skills. But how we teach skills is what we're going to be talking about today, right? The other thing that we've done a lot is centering the dominant narrative, centering stories. Like, whose stories are we centering? Whose stories are we telling? And that matters because our world, like, first of all, here in the United States, our country has become so much more diverse. But across the world, the children that are graduating now are becoming global citizens. And as global citizens, we have to start to center every person's story. We have to start to center different cultural stories so that our children are prepared to enter that world. So this has been a problem of inequity in our society, of centering certain stories and then leaving marginalized children in marginalized stories and keeping them marginalized, right? Not to use the word over and over again, but that's what it's been. We've also had this propagation of classroom caste. In other words, we've been leveling our kids into failure, right? When you start to think about, I was listening to Dr. Anita Archer this morning, as a matter of fact, and she was talking about how we level children, even in kindergarten and first grade, when students are learning foundational skills, we level them and provide, like, if we're going over multisyllabic words, we'll give some kids the easiest of those multisyllabic words, and other children are engaging in those really high level words. And that's how we start to create what I like to call long-term intervention students, right? The purpose of intervention is to get kids out, but when we start leveling kids, even in kindergarten, then what we're creating is a situation where our children are going to have to struggle in order to become avid readers. So we had to think about what it is that we're doing there. And then the last thing is data that compromises, right? And I love talking about data because, you know, data will tell the story that you want it to tell, depending on how you set that narrative. There's data that doesn't lie, and then there's data that you can look at, and then you can make up a story to fit whatever it is that you want it to fit, right? We talk a lot about making sure that we go beyond what we call norms. In other words, that we go beyond that 50th percentile picture, and we let people know, like, hey, this is the full picture of data. And the other thing that I have to say about this is, behind every data point is a child. When we're talking about education, there's a person behind that data point. And so we cannot compromise to the point where we're telling stories about what our data tells us in order to skew whatever story we want it to tell. We have to tell the truth when it comes to data. So when we think about those 4 challenges, and we have to think about what it is that we want to do in order to change the narrative and in order to change the pedagogy in the classroom for our children to learn how to read, right? I'm in the process of reading Lisa Delpit's Other People's Children. And let me tell you something, I can't put this book down. I love it. I don't know how I've gone through my entire educational career and not read this book, but this quote is from her book, and she talks about, and she wrote, this is from an essay that she wrote in 1984, which blew my mind, because I'm like, this woman's been dropping gems since 1984. And you know, she was so far ahead of her time, and people are now paying attention, right? So she says, I believe that skills are best taught through meaningful communication, best learned in meaningful context. I would further explain that skills are a necessary but insufficient aspect of Black and minority students' education. In other words, we have to go beyond just teaching skills. And the reason why is because the data is telling us so, right? When we look at graduation rates by next to college readiness, and by college readiness, I'm using the ACT as a measure here, we see that white students, by and large, are graduating at a higher rate in the United States, and that white students are meeting 3 or more ACT benchmarks when they graduate. And when we look at how Latinx students are performing relative to their white counterparts, Latinx students are graduating at an 81%. So now we've dropped 9%, right? And then the students, those same students that have taken the ACT, the number nearly drops by a little over double, because our students are telling us, okay, even though we're graduating from high school, something's going on where our kids are not college ready. And when we look at that same data for Black students, now that number's dropped by more than triple, right? So when we look at overall data, and as I said, data is going to tell the story we wanted to tell, right? This orange bar in the middle, this is from 2015, because that was the last time that Pisa and Nate met up. But when we look at the data for the United States, it sits right there in the middle. It's in orange. We're not where we used to be. We're certainly not last in the world, right? In terms of how we are performing on our data. But when you disaggregate the data and you look at how white students are performing relative to Black students or Latinx students, there's a story being told here. And that's why I said data can be skewed any way you want, right? Because the story that we're seeing is, oh, the United States on average is performing pretty okay compared to other industrialized countries. But when we separate the data, white students are experiencing school in a much different way, right? And I'm saying all of this because we have to start to think about the need. Why do we need culturally responsive teaching? What is the purpose of it? What is this going to do for our students? And I'm going to stop and, okay, there's a lot going on in the chat, so I'm going to stop in a second and look at that. But when we start to ask ourselves why we need culturally responsive teaching, there are two things that are happening. The data is telling us that we need to engage students differently. We're in what I like to call an engagement crisis. Our kids are not engaging with school, so we have to figure out what is going on in there, what's going on in these classrooms. But the other reason why is because as of 2014, our public school student population in the United States is now majority non-white. We're actually, I think, at 53% now in 2021, right? And if our data is telling us that children are not experiencing school the same way, then it's time, as my friend Chandra says, that we stop differentiating the instruction and start differentiating ourselves as educators so that all students can engage with content and so that all students can meet academic excellence, right? So we have to know what our goal is. Today, I'm going to be talking about a few different approaches to culturally responsive teaching, but I want you to know these are not the only books out there. As I said, I'm reading Lisa Delpit right now, if you want to read her first. But the purpose of today is to give you an introduction to these different approaches to engaging students. And you know, when I look at culturally responsive teaching from a basic understanding, the basic understanding of culturally responsive teaching is really giving us an in. It's giving us an in to our students to create engagement in our classroom so that all students can perform at an excellent level, so that everyone can have high academic marks, right? So we're not giving up on any children. We're engaging our kids, and we're going to talk about that. To level set the conversation, I typically lean into Geneva Gay's definition of culturally responsive teaching, not because she, let me just clarify, she was not the first person to talk about culturally responsive teaching. In fact, folks have been talking about cultural responsiveness for decades, but Gloria Ladson-Billings in the 90s, she coined the term culturally relevant teaching, but hers was the what it was. Her book was really about like, what is this? Like, this is what's going on in our schools, and this is something that we should be looking at. When Geneva Gay wrote her book, it was more like the how-to, right? So I love to center the conversation around Geneva Gay's definition, especially because anyone who you're reading now, who's written anything since 2000, has looked at Geneva Gay's work and has built upon that work, right? So when we look at this definition, it's an approach that emphasizes using the cultural knowledge, prior experiences, frames of reference, and performance styles of ethnically diverse students to make learning encounters more relevant to and effective for them. And let me say that it has since evolved because it's not just about ethnically diverse students anymore. Because people have been doing more and more research, we're also talking about like what region a student might be from or what interests a student has. So there are different things that make up a student's identity that has really expanded the way in which we engage students in a classroom through culturally responsive teaching, right? So if you have no familiarity with the concept and you want to have some familiarity with the concept, my first recommendation is that you read this article at newamerica.org. It's on the 8 competencies for culturally responsive teaching, right? What I loved about this article is like 16 pages long. It gives you these quick nuggets on these 8 competencies. And for me, what it did is that it piqued my interest just enough for me to want to go and read something else, right? New America's got like a lot of really great articles that you can engage with to learn a little more. But if you haven't read anybody, I would recommend that you read this first and then look at the resources list and then go from there, because there are a ton of resources that are listed that you can then read as you go along. And what I also love about this is that it gets your mind primed for what you should be thinking about as you start to build out your own culturally responsive classroom. All right. Thank you for posting that, Alice. That's great. All right. So when we start to think about who needs to be taught through this lens, right? And why we need this, there's this discourse, right? There's this conversation always that is centered around marginalized kids, and it's typically deficit based, right? So there's like this notion of a lacking for youth of color. Like they lack language and culture and family support and academic skills and sometimes even moral character, right, to succeed or excel. And I question that, right? In fact, I say nonsense to that, right? Because I think that it's really important for us as educators to learn about the communities that our children are from, and also to do our best to understand who our children are at the core, right? Zaretta Hammond has this in her book. It's based off of Judith Kleinfeld's work. Judith Kleinfeld did a lot of research up in Alaska with the Native Alaskan people. And Zaretta Hammond put together this beautiful warm demander chart, is what she calls it, right? So, you know, as a warm demander, we want to show up in the classroom and be that person who shows the students that we care for them, that we love them, that, you know, that they matter. But we also have this high level of active demandingness, which is what Zaretta Hammond calls it. And what we're doing is expecting excellence from those students, from those same students, no matter what their situation is, no matter what their circumstances. We say to them, I love you, I care for you, you will perform, you will succeed in here academically, right? When you look at the other quadrants, right, I know that all of us have known someone who fits into one of those quadrants. I've known sentimentalists. In other words, what I tell people is these are people who love their students to failure, who say, oh, you know, so-and-so had a really rough morning this morning. You know, the police was at their house last night. I'm just making up a scenario. I can't expect them to learn he's really tired, right? We're loving our kid to failure. Or he's so hungry, there's no way I could ever expect this kid to do this work. Children know why they're in school. We have to hold them to those high expectations. TNTP is the opportunity myth tells us that the number one denominator of what makes our kids successful, or what impacts our kids' success the most, is teacher expectations. So if our expectations are that our kids are going to do the work, that they are going to perform, that they are going to learn when they come into our classrooms, then that is precisely what they are going to do, because that is the expectation that we have of them. But if our expectation is that they can't do the work, we can't ask them to do this, they don't know enough language to do this, or they can't do the work because I don't believe they can do the work, I'm an elitist at this point, right? That's what the other quadrant is. Or they can do the work, but they don't think I care about them because now I'm looking at that technocrat quadrant. Then what we're doing is setting up our kids for failure. And what we want to do is the opposite of that. So in order for us to be to have an optimal space, or an optimal culturally responsive space, we have to be warm demanders first, right? The other thing that Dr. Shraki Holly tells us is that we have to be attuned to our deficit monitor. So not only do you want to strive to be a warm demander, but in order for you to get to the point where you are a warm demander, you have to check your bias. Now, you know how people would say, oh, you got to check your attitude at the door. In this case, you have to check your bias at the door. We all have bias. This is not something that is specific to any one race, gender, ethnicity, right? Everyone carries bias. So it is our duty as educators to leave that bias outside of our classroom and teach all of our students as best as we can so that they can all succeed, right? Goldie Muhammad tells us in her story, in her book, and I love her book, I'm gonna talk about it a little bit later, but she tells us about a really simple way for us to establish rapport with our kids in our classroom day one, right? When I was teaching, I used to do procedures on the first day. We would create rules together, or I would learn all my kids' names, or I would sit them in their seats, right? So rather than doing all of that, we can do a name narrative. Everyone has a story about their name. I saw somebody say hello from Ghana. Depending on what day of the week you're born in Ghana, you have a name based off of that day of the week, right? There's a story for our kids to tell us. So when we look at our name narratives, it's not just about the student telling us who they are. This is also an opportunity as an educator to tell your students who you are, right? So this is validating not only for you as an educator in the space, but it's also validating for the student as well. And that's when we start to build rapport and trust in the classroom with our kiddos, right? So Dr. Holly also tells us about how to vab. This is his term. I promise you, I did not make up Be Fabulous. He did this himself. He's an amazing individual. We work with him quite a bit. But when we look at these 4 tenets of Dr. Holly's work, right, we're looking at validating our students. We're intentionally and purposely legitimizing the home culture and language of our students in the process, right, as we teach them. When we affirm our students, we're intentionally and purposely reversing the negative stereotypes and images and that deficit language that's attached to our marginalized cultures and languages in order to promote trust and rapport in our classrooms, right? And in that process, we're continue to build trust, we're building that rapport, and we're recognizing cultural and linguistic behaviors of our students as assets in our classrooms in order to use that, in order to bridge students into academic success. As I said, at its root, at the basic level of culturally responsive teaching, the point is to get students to be academically excellent. So we have to start to think about how our identities impact our learning, right? I like to call these entry points. Every student, no one person is the same. Every student has a story, and there are so many things that make up kids. There are so many things that make up adults, right? So we have to start to think about how our identities and how our cultures impact our learning. In Zaretta Hammond's book, okay, so let me just clarify. Dr. Holly uses an iceberg. Zaretta Hammond has Eliza Maynard's tree in her book. This is not the image. I just changed it because I think this is prettier, but I love using the tree analogy because it's very easy to understand when we start to think about how we engage students at 3 different levels of culture, right? A tree has branches, it has a trunk, and it has roots. So at the shallow level, we're at the branches, we're looking at observable patterns that have low emotional impacts on trust with students. So we're looking at food, we're looking at dance, holidays. If you've ever taken a foreign language class, like if you've taken a Spanish class, they're like, we're going to take a tour around Central and South America and the Caribbean, Spanish speaking countries. And then you learn about each one of those countries, what food, what dance, what holiday. It's not a bad thing. It is a good thing to celebrate all of those things, but those things are not going to have a high impact on emotional trust with students. So we have to dig deeper, right? So Zaretta Hammond says, okay, we've got to go into surface culture. That's when you start to really build rapport. For example, do we know how this particular person of this culture interprets eye contact? So for example, in our culture, when you get in trouble, I'm Dominican, in my culture, if you're being reprimanded, you look down, you don't make eye contact with an adult, right? That's something that is different from having been in school with my American teachers who have said to me, look at me when I'm talking to you, right? So there's a clear conflict of culture there, and that's something that we have to understand. And then when we start to think about the implications of defiance with marginalized students and what that means, it's really important for a teacher to know whether or not a student is supposed to be making eye contact or not according to their culture, right? So then when we start to look at deep cultural connections, things that have an intense emotional impact on trust, now we're looking at the ways that people move within their cultural spaces, right? So for example, does this culture have a preference for competition or cooperation? And this is a biggie, y'all. This is a biggie because for those of us who live in the United States, we are a competitive culture by nature, but we are a culture made up of many different cultures, and many different cultures are more collectivist in nature than American culture. And there's a clash because a lot of our teachers are American teachers, right? We have to be able to identify which cultures lean into collectivism and which cultures lean into competition. I always tell people, if you remember if any of you watched the 2016 World Cup, when Japan played, after the game was over, the people of Japan stayed in the stands and they were cleaning up the stadium. And I didn't learn until later why. When I went to Japan, I realized how much respect there was in that culture for the environment. And collectively, they take care of their environment. And so when I thought about that moment of watching the people of Japan ensuring that the stadium was cleaned up, it's something that they do collectively as a culture. So when I think about collectivism, right, in a culture, one thing I can tell you that is a common thread in culturally responsive teaching is this idea of collectivism, how we can help one another learn, how we can lean on each other, how we look at each other's assets to build on our academic excellence. And what that looks like, right, in a classroom is, for example, if I raise my hand to answer a question, we value taking turns to speak. If I shout out an answer, then we also value speaking at the same time. If we pick a student at random, we value everyone's voice, not just those who choose to speak up. So we're not saying, oh no, not in here, you can't shout out, you can't, right? We're gonna tell you, we're gonna affirm that, and we're gonna affirm the kid who raises their hand, right? So that's something that we have to start to think about, how we can shift our minds, how we can differentiate ourselves as educators so that our classrooms are more inclusive and that our classrooms give access to more children than those who are part of the dominant culture in that space at the start of the year, right? So lastly, I wanna highlight Goldie Muhammad's work, not because it's, because I don't wanna talk about anyone else's, it's because if you read enough on cultural responsiveness, what you'll find is that Goldie Muhammad's framework is a great place for you to put all of the things that you've learned and allow for your classroom to have an optimal space for student learning, right? Goldie Muhammad's book is called Cultivating Genius, and she really believes that she feels like the framework allows for teaching to happen in a space that will cultivate genius, not only for our students, but also for our teachers. It's supposed to empower everyone in the space, give everyone confidence and self-reliance, right? And the way that she created, or the way that she wrote the framework, it has these 5 parts. So in her book right now, I don't know if her second edition is out yet, but in the book as it is written right now, there's only the first 4 tenets of the framework, but she's just added joy. So if you can catch one of her webinars, please do. But she talks about identity development, right? We're asking students to make sense of who they are. Then we're doing skills development. So we're asking students to develop their proficiencies in the content areas, but within the context of culturally responsive content, okay? So it's not in isolation. We're teaching skills through the use of culturally responsive text, okay? And that's what I meant by, we don't throw away the skills development, we just shift the way that we think about skills development. And then we're developing students' intellect. So we're asking our students to be smart about something. We're knowledge building, essentially. And that shouldn't be something that's a strange concept to anyone, especially if you've been studying Johns Hopkins work. And then there's this notion of criticality, which is teaching our kids to be critical thinkers, to ask them to question authority, to ask them to question what they read, all in a respectful way. But it's meant so that they understand power and they understand how to hone their own power, so that they can see things through that critical lens. And lastly, of course, joy, so that our kids feel joy. We want our kids to feel joy. We want them to love literacy, right? That is the purpose. So when we start to think about the way that Goldie Muhammad, or why Goldie Muhammad wrote the framework, how she came up with it, it was all centered in the Black literary societies, right? Black literary societies, they, first of all, some were illegal. So that was one, because Black people were not supposed to read at certain points in time in history because they were risking their lives to do so. So this was a means of empowerment. Secondly, they were collective. So people learned from one another. They debated one another. So, you know, talking about developing those listening, speaking, reading, and writing skills, right? So we were developing language as they were developing power. So the purpose of her framework is to empower our kids, and also what it does, and she quotes it here, but or she says it here, where she says that we have to start to think about what the purpose of school is. What is the purpose? Literacy is in everything that our kids do. So we have to start to think about what we want our children to learn and how we want our children to learn in their learning spaces, and how we want to cultivate their genius. So before I finish up, I want to actually give you a walkthrough on some literature. I bought both of these books for my son. On the left, you're looking at a book called Henry's Freedom Box. On the right, Ada Twist Scientist. My son loves Ada Twist. I love Ada Twist. All my friends love Ada Twist. And I bought Henry's Freedom Box because I'd known about the story, and I thought it was going to be a great book. There were a lot of there were a lot of reviews that said, oh, this is a great book. So I was like, okay, I'm going to get this book. But then I get to page 3 and here's the language, right? Henry and his brothers and sisters worked in the big house where master lived. Henry's master had been good to Henry and his family. I highlight this because I think it's really important for us to understand that just because something looks like it could be culturally responsive doesn't mean that it is. We have to be diligent about what we put in front of our children and ensure that we're not causing harm in the process of trying to engage our students, right? This romanticizes enslavement. I just finished reading The Origin of Others by Toni Morrison, and she talks about the romanticization of enslavement a lot in that text. But we have to be really careful so that we don't have language like Henry's master had been good to Henry and his family, because how could anyone be good to a person who was living under the circumstances of enslavement? He was not free, right? So we have to think about that. It just so happens that when I was showing this to my colleague was like, oh, we have that story. And I was like, no, we don't. And he was like, yes, we do, because we were working with the Schomburg Center in order to put some really high quality, authentic text into our new comprehension series. And I was like, what? So I pulled that out. And the authentic language around that is satisfied that it would be far better to peril his life for freedom in this way than to remain under the galling yoke of slavery. He entered his box. It was safely nailed up and hooped with 5 hickory hoops, and when that was then addressed to William H. Johnston, Arch Street, Philadelphia, marked this side up with care. It was 26 hours from the time he left Richmond until his arrival in the city of brotherly love. So understand, story about the same person, 2 different authors. The left is some problematic language, the right has authentic language, and none of it is politicized. It's just that you read the authentic language piece, and you hear the urgency, you read the urgency of this person wanting to escape enslavement, okay? Ada Twist, I love to show just because she's a Black girl who loves science. Her family supports her in this love of science. She asks a ton of questions. So in this one, she's asking like all about this grandfather clock and says, why isn't it called a granddaughter clock? And she's asking all these questions about science and what's this and what's that. And her parents just support her so much. And I have to say that Ada Twist is in Spanish. And I love it because it's trans-adapted, and the meaning of it, the curiosity, the comical aspect of it, none of it is lost in this translation, which I love, right? And you know, the purpose of this, right? At the end of the day, as I said, is to create joy. This is my friend's daughter, Pepper. She had to dress up as a favorite character for school and won the contest, but her dad, her dad photoshopped her on the cover. But I love showing this picture because she loves Ada Twist. She loves it so much. This book brings her joy. It does not bring harm. It is a book that engages her interest. It piques her interest, right? So, you know, when we start to think about authentic text, the importance of giving students content that is responsive to them, the importance of a student seeing themselves in text before 12th grade, before they're introduced to Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon, we have to start to think about how we put content in front of our kids. And then for us, we've been thinking about ensuring that kids are also exposed to heroes, right? Heroes that look like them. In this case, we're looking at William Still, an unsung hero of the Underground Railroad, who kept a ledger of everyone who came through the Underground Railroad in Philadelphia, hid it in a cemetery, was risking his life every day. And to this day, his ledger is still used to authenticate people's families' histories because of the work that he did. And so we have the biography by him, and then we also included an autobiographical piece by him telling the story of one of the women who came through his office, right? So again, we want to focus on ensuring that our kids are getting access, that our kids are seeing themselves, that our kids are finding joy in what they're reading, and that we are differentiating ourselves as adults as opposed to trying to differentiate instruction, right? And I will stop my presentation with this quote: there's no such thing as a kid who hates reading. There are kids who love reading and kids who are reading the wrong books. I will turn it back over to you, Julius. Thank you.
Wow, is my first reaction. So many good nuggets. One, I appreciate the fact that you gave us a wealth of resources, and particularly great Black thought leaders that we don't really get to hear and read about. I've been a fan of Lisa Delpit's for ages. I won't tell you when I was in graduate school and had to read it. I read it way back then. And I'm absolutely a fan of Dr. Muhammad's. And so I love the fact that you raised that question, what is your story? Because Dr. Muhammad talks about that a lot. And so that's what I'm going to throw at you, because you came to this presentation with a lot of intellect. And I think it takes a lot of courage to do the kind of work that you're doing and to share the things that you're sharing. So tell us a little bit about your story. How did you arrive at having a consciousness for this kind
That's a great question. Okay, so I think I've always had a consciousness, right? But I have to say that there's always been like this lingering question of how to engage and how to own my Blackness, okay? And as a Dominican American, that was really hard coming up because we have a lot of race relation issues in Dominican Republic, okay? And when I got to college, I was introduced to so much Black literature by my professor, may he rest in peace, Dr. Michael Namfi. And it changed my life dramatically, right? I started to look at things from a completely different perspective. I started to think about my experience as a student, right? I went to Milton Hershey School in Hershey, Pennsylvania. It's a boarding school for low-income students. And while I was there, I had teachers who were anti-racist, and I really didn't know it until later, right? And even now, to this day, I talk about my name narrative because my name narrative is tied to my 10th grade biology teacher, Mr. Tim Landenberger, right? So I think that I've always been aware of who I am. But then when I started teaching, I realized that my kids needed more than what I was told to give them. And I brought it. And I wanted them to feel what I felt in Professor Namfi's class in college. And I felt like it was like my duty to do that. But there was a lot of things that were barriers. I was young, first of all. And then I didn't feel like I was experiencing teaching school the way that I experienced school as a student, because I was in that unique situation where I was in boarding school. And then, you go through this career and I was selling textbooks, and then I got burnt out. And when I got to my former gig at another company, I started to get back to the root of who I was. And now that I'm at Curriculum Associates, we're doing this work where we're engaging in providing content to students that makes a difference, that matters, that allows students to see themselves. And I feel like at this point in my life and in my career, if I'm not going to be vocal about the students who look like me, who are coming up like me, for students who may not have seen anyone until they were in 12th grade who looked like them in text that they were reading, that I needed to be a person that was vocal about that for those students so that they wouldn't have that experience, so that they could have it earlier. That was a long answer to your question.
No, but that was good. And talk about that courage. That's
yes.
what I'm talking about. I love that. I love that. Here's a question that I'm gonna get to the folks that are here with us on the webinar. But let me ask this real quick, because I know someone out there want to know this question. You are encouraging culturally responsive pedagogy in spaces where a lot of times, principals, curriculum, instructional folks, they're not really into that kind of stuff. So if you are a teacher that really wants to make sure that your practices in the classroom are relevant and responsive, what is your encouragement to them? How do you encourage them to live in that space, but also, follow the policies of the powers that be?
So first of all, I just have to say that, if teaching was a corporation and the and the product was the outcomes, right? And our customers were the students, then our responsibility is to the customer, is it not? It's to the student, right? So it's to the student, right? And I think that there's a lot of conflation right now of what culturally responsive teaching is, what critical race theory is, what's law, what's not law. And I will say this, there is so much literature that is wonderful, that is rich, that is engaging, right? I want to say like 15 years ago, I just so happened to look at, I think it was a national reading conference of some sort. Toni Morrison was on the panel, Cornell West, and it was about how do we engage Black students? And someone asked Toni Morrison, how would you engage Black students? And she said, give them the good stuff first, period. That was it. That's all she said. And so as far as I'm concerned, I think it's just really important that we look at content first. Like when we look at canons, I'm a former high school English teacher, so I should be the first one. And I love Shakespeare. Let me put that out there. I do. I love Shakespeare. But I don't think that Shakespeare needs to be taught for 8 years, from 7th grade all the way to 12th grade, or 6 years. I don't think that Shakespeare needs to be taught that many times, because our kids have such a hard time engaging with it, right? And then it's a heavy lift to have to try to translate Shakespearean English into a language that our kids understand and then talk about it, right? So, and I just said that to a group of teachers from a town that has like a 10-month Shakespearean festival. I didn't even know that, right? But all I'm trying to say is, when we look at the canon, when we look at the literary canon, it's mostly written by white men. White men do not make up the majority of our students. And there's a lot of rich literature out there that can speak to our students, that is responsive to who they are. Like, I know I've been talking about Ghana a lot. You just so happen to catch my attention. But I have a book called Homegoing by Yagaisi. It's a young adult book. And she's Ghanaian. And that book is so good. I love the book. And I bought her second one. I haven't even read it yet. And I'm like, why can't we teach that? Right? Why can't we teach In the Time of the Butterflies by Julia Alvarez in school? Why aren't we teaching those books? That's not critical race theory. That's just giving kids a different lens to a different culture.
Absolutely.
That's all I'm saying.
Absolutely. Let me segue, because that's a great segue into one of the attendees' questions.
Sure.
They're asking, can you explain the difference between culturally responsive and culturally competent? Is there a difference between those two ideas, those two terms?
I rarely hear people call anything culturally competent. When I think about the word competent, it makes me feel like, do you understand? That's what I hear. Like, do you understand? Right. But like, culturally responsive is responding to your student, right? You have culturally sustaining, which is now you're sustaining the student's culture, you're sustaining who the students are, and you're not even trying to bridge, you're trying to just keep them engaging in, or it's changing you, not the student, right? There's culturally restorative for our Native American people, to restore, because we have to restore that culture in our teaching. But culturally competent, I mean, I feel like that's like the surface level. That's like the frosting before you even get into the cake, right? So you know, I would venture to say that you should dig a little deeper, for sure.
Right. I know some thought leaders have explained cultural competency mainly for adults and not for children.
Yes.
And that you should become competent in terms of the culture of the children that you serve.
And not appropriate.
Yeah, exactly. And as you were talking earlier, digging deeper, knowing more about how those cultures address each other, people within the culture addressing each other, those kinds of things lend to competency, cultural competency.
Right.
That's, you know, the food, the dress, and where it's located. So let's see here. We have a couple other questions. Please address the issues connected with teaching reading to adults, particularly incarcerated adults. High interest, low ability level, materials are extremely difficult. And I know in your bio, you talk a little bit about having some experience with adult teaching.
Yeah, so the first thing you have to know about teaching adults is, I always look at, so when I think about folks who have like low literacy, folks who struggle with literacy, or folks who are learning English as a second language, those teaching approaches are the same, in my opinion, right? You have to teach decoding. And let me explain. By decoding, like, you have to teach how words are made up, right? You have to, so we're teaching reading skills, which is typically what we learn from kindergarten to second grade, is teaching folks how to read. And then you have to find content that is age appropriate in order to do that. One of the, I'm trying to remember the company that we used to use for older children's books, like for high school students, right? That was a lot more, you know, there weren't ducks running around in the story is what I'm saying. And if it comes to me, I will write it in the chat, because there is a publisher that specifically publishes for older individuals. So that's one. Number two, I think that when you're dealing with adults, there has to be a motivation there, right? When you're dealing with like incarcerated folks, like there has to be a motivation as to why we're teaching. Like when you look at Goldie Muhammad's framework, she talks about empowerment. What are we doing when we're teaching adults? Are we empowering them to do something? In my case, when I was teaching adults, we were teaching them to read in English in order for them to know their rights as members of society, because a lot of them were not legal here as immigrants. So we were teaching them what their rights were in the state of New Jersey, so that if something ever happened, they were able to defend themselves and they knew what to do. So as far as I'm concerned, when it comes to teaching adults, especially adults in incarceration, there has to be a level of empowerment, and there has to be a commitment to something outside of just learning to read for them to have that motivation. And the other thing is, I think, especially if you're dealing with folks who have struggled with reading their whole lives, it's the belief that they can. It's letting that person know that they are able to do this, because I would assume that those folks have heard their entire lives that they cannot. So, you know, it also requires you to be a warm demander, right? In that moment. So, yeah.
Absolutely. So we're going to take one more question, because we're just about out of time. And I
remember Saddleback Publishing. Okay. I'm done.
Gotcha. Because I want you to give some parting kind of comments, because I know you're going to have some good ones. So I'll take this last question. Is from Heather. She basically is asking, how can you take the whole idea around a culturally responsive curricula and adapt that to science? Can you cross connect cultural competency or relevancy?
Yes. So one, go and get Goldie Muhammad's book, because you're going to be like, what? She already did it, right? Julius, you might be in agreement with me on that, but please.
I am, 100%.
Yes. So here's an example, right? So let's just say that I'm just making this up off the top of my head, y'all, so don't judge me. But let's just say that you are in a biology class, and you have students who are predominantly from Mexico. Your science instruction can be centered around the flora in the Maya Riviera or the Yucatan Peninsula, or it can be around why cenotes were created, which are the underground, what's it called, caves with water. You know, they're underground cities. You can, if you're looking at it from the perspective of archaeology, then we can look at, okay, what is the history of the Mayan people in that part of the country? So there's an opportunity, I think, when we start to look at from a science perspective, so many different things. Like when I was in 9th grade, my science teacher had us create a road trip to all of the 5 of the national parks, and we had to get into what was at the national park, what animals we could find there, what you would go and visit. So she made it like relevant to who we were and what we were living, and you know, and all that. So there is a way to make it culturally relevant, but it is going to take a little bit of research. Like you'll have to probably find out like what's going on in your students' countries. Like in Dominican Republic, they mine amber. So if you're a earth science teacher, then you can talk about mining amber.
Yeah, and here's another thought. There are so many Black scientists who have done work that is culturally connected. And so that's an area that you might want to research. And if you're talking about the lower grades, there's a ton of picture books that connect science to the protagonists in that book, their everyday life and culture. And so, like you said, Goldie has done it, and everybody else. You got to do research. Really to make those connections. Denise, we're friends now.
Okay, Julius, I'm gonna look you up when I go to St. Louis.
Cool, cool. Give us some parting words because we have some other information we need to share with the attendees, but I don't want to leave until you sort of like summarize, where do we go from here?
I would say go and read something, pick up the article, pick up one of these books, and then just go and explore that and see how you can start to introduce some of these approaches into your classroom. Honestly, that's all I can really share. It's needed. The kids are asking for it, honestly. And you will see a difference in the way they engage in your space if you do.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing your heart, because I think
Thank you.
that's what you honestly did today. It does take courage. And as a Black man to a sister, I'm just going to put it out there. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie.
Thank you for showing up in the world as you are right now today.
Thank you.
And thank you to Curriculum and Curriculum Associates
Yes.
for giving you this opportunity to share with all of us so that we all can learn and become better educators. Thank you.
Thank
all right.
you.
We'll see you later. I think now we have a few announcements that we want to make in terms of things that are coming up, other webinars that the International Literacy Association will be supporting soon. On Wednesday, June 16th at 5 p.m. Eastern, join ILA for a writing instruction that grows writers through a focus on feedback and process. And this ILA webinar, speaker Sarah M. Zerwin will explore strategies to focus students on the process of writing and their own growth rather than on perfect, polished, final drafts. Then on Wednesday, July 14th at 5 p.m. Eastern, join ILA for tackling tough topics through middle grade literature. And this ILA webinar for middle grade authors, Barbara D., Superya Kelker, Hannah Khan, Donna Gephardt will discuss the importance of using fiction to introduce tough topics to middle grade readers as part of a moderated conversation led by educator Tu and Nguyen. This panel will cover social emotional learning and how to address difficult subjects such as divorce, drug addiction, child cancer, and cultural identity in a sensitive way. Also, please keep an eye out for the ILA digital events webpage, and that's on the ILA's webpage, literacyworldwide.org/digital events for additional on-demand content and webinars that are coming up and things that you might have missed as well. And here are a couple of things that you might have missed that you want to take advantage of. One is the ILA Children's Literature Intensive, Creating a Culturally Responsive Classroom Through Books, hosted by Dr. Tiffany A. Flowers, where we focus on the next step, incorporating culturally relevant and responsive children's literature in meaningful ways. The event features more than 20 authors through a mix of live sessions, panels, conversations, and keynotes. Don't miss your chance to take away concrete ideas on how to do this important work instead of simply hearing about why. One last, in case you missed it, our recent ILA webinar with Dr. Sonia Cherry Paul, in which we grounded ourselves in critical literacy pedagogies and explore writing about reading strategies that support students' powerful expression of ideas. We look at critical literacy lenses such as positioning, microaggression, power, and resistance, and apply them to a variety of texts. And by doing so, we can support students in reading, analyzing, and evaluating literature in their lives. It's been a phenomenal, phenomenal evening. We've heard a lot of great things. I want to thank our supporters, again, Curriculum Associates and iReady. And most of all, we want to thank Glendaliz Martinez Almonte. Thank you. we bid you guys a great evening, peace, love, and joy. Good night.